lightheaded.
Let's get you seated.
Hold on, sir. He's going down.
I've got him. Pulse ox ready?
Sir, can you hear me? Stay with us.
Take a close look at this security footage. In just a few brief seconds, a man dressed in medical attire appears at the front door of a house, carrying a bag of equipment. Everything seems completely normal, at least at first, but that moment would later become a key piece of evidence in a murder investigation. And what doctors discovered afterward turned that routine visit into the center of a serious criminal case. Patrick O'Hara was an elderly man living in Newcastle, England. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where daily life moved slowly and with little change. Those around him described him as calm, friendly, and approachable. He was not someone who stood out or drew attention. On the contrary, he was the type of person who lived simply, kept to himself, and maintained a steady routine for many years. In recent years, O'Hara had been living with his girlfriend in a private house in the area. Their life together appeared normal, with no signs of instability or notable conflict. Their relationship was seen by neighbors and acquaintances as stable and long-term. They appeared to be a couple accustomed to living together, sharing daily routines naturally and without anything unusual. According to recorded information, O'Hara regularly supported and cared for his girlfriend in daily life. He took on household responsibilities, helped with small tasks, and maintained their shared life in a steady manner. His role in the relationship was not only that of a partner, but also that of a supporter and a companion in everyday life. There were no signs indicating that he was in danger. There was no information about serious personal conflicts, no public disputes, and no factors suggesting that he could become the target of an attack. From an outside perspective, Patrick O'Hara's life was a typical image of an elderly man living a stable and peaceful life in a familiar environment. However, this seemingly ordinary relationship would later become the central element in a serious criminal case. The woman living with him was not only his girlfriend, but also had a son. And this family connection, a detail that did not attract attention at first, would later become one of the most important factors in the investigation. January 22nd, 2024 began like any other ordinary day at Patrick O'Hara's home. Everything took place in a familiar, quiet setting. At some point during the day, a man appeared at the front door. He was dressed in medical clothing and carried a bag of equipment similar to what is typically seen in home medical visits. The man said that he had been sent to administer a vaccine injection. In a context where home healthcare services were not uncommon, this explanation did not raise any clear suspicion. The door was opened. The man was invited inside. Inside, he behaved naturally and followed a sequence identical to that of a real medical professional. He carried out basic checks, had a brief exchange, and prepared his equipment. Every action was smooth, with no signs of hesitation or error. There were no details unusual enough to make the victim suspicious. After completing the preparation, the man proceeded with the injection. The entire process was quick, orderly, and consistent with how a routine medical procedure is normally performed. Once the injection was finished, he packed up his equipment, left the house, and disappeared from the scene. At that moment, everything seemed to have ended like a normal home visit. But just a few hours later, the situation began to change. Patrick O'Hara began to feel pain at the site on his arm where he had just been injected. At first, it may have seemed like mild discomfort, a reaction that is not uncommon after an injection. However, the pain quickly became more severe. The injection site began to show unusual signs, and his condition deteriorated at an abnormal rate. As the symptoms became clear and concerning, O'Hara was taken to the hospital. There, doctors quickly realized that his condition did not resemble a normal reaction to a vaccine injection. Signs of infection appeared at a more severe level than expected. Tests were conducted immediately, and the results showed that he was suffering from a serious infection, a condition that could spread if not treated promptly. Faced with that risk, the medical team was forced to carry out emergency surgery to control and remove the infected area, preventing it from spreading to other parts of the body. What they observed did not match any typical reaction. The level of damage, the speed of progression, and the nature of the infection all indicated that something was not right. In response to these unusual signs, the doctors did not stop at treatment alone. They quickly realized that this might no longer be a purely medical issue. Based on their professional experience, they understood that the condition could be linked to an unknown substance introduced into the patient's body. During the course of treating the case, the medical team made a critical decision: to contact the police directly and report a suspicious case. The information was relayed under urgent circumstances, while the patient's condition was still being managed in the operating room. For the doctors, this was not just a severe infection, but a sign that an intentional act of harm may have occurred. From that moment on, the case officially moved beyond the scope of a medical incident. It became the starting point of a criminal investigation initiated by the doctor's decision to raise the alarm. After the doctors reported this unusual case, Newcastle police quickly received the information and opened an official investigation. In the initial stage, the case was treated as a situation with abnormal signs related to healthcare, but investigators understood that they needed to verify each detail accurately before reaching any conclusions. Their first step was to determine the identity of the person who had administered the injection at the victim's home. This was a key factor because if this person was truly a healthcare worker, all information related to the appointment and staff assignment would have to be recorded in the official system. Investigators proceeded to check data within the national healthcare system, including vaccine appointment records, staff assignment logs, and home care services in the area. However, the results revealed a clear anomaly. There was no vaccine appointment registered for Patrick O'Hara's address on the day the incident occurred. They did not stop there. They continued to review the list of medical staff assigned during the corresponding time period. The result remained unchanged. No staff had been sent to that address. There were no records, no schedule, and no trace within the official system. From that point, the initial assessment began to change. What had once been considered a legitimate home medical visit now became a situation showing signs of impersonation. Investigators concluded that the man who appeared at the victim's house had used a false identity to gain access. After establishing the impersonation factor, the next step of the investigation was to reconstruct the movements of this man. Investigators collected and analyzed data from security camera systems in the area surrounding the house. They reviewed each frame within the relevant time window, searching for any indication that could confirm the presence of an unknown individual. Several cameras captured images of a man wearing medical clothing entering the neighborhood at the exact time the incident occurred. He was carrying a bag of equipment and moving into the residential area, consistent with the time the victim reported receiving the medical worker. Although the man's face was obscured by a mask and cap, making direct identification difficult, the details of his clothing, behavior, and timing all matched the statements and the sequence of events. These images not only confirmed that the man had indeed been present in the area, but also reinforced an important point. This was not information based on the victim's assumption, but an event that had actually occurred and was recorded. From this point on, the investigation began to shift in a clearer direction, no longer focused on verifying a medical incident, but on identifying an individual who had deliberately approached the victim under the guise of a healthcare worker. Next, the police shifted their focus to another important detail: the vaccine invitation letter that the victim had received earlier. This was the factor that played a starting role in the entire incident, because it was this document that created a reasonable pretext for the unknown man to approach the victim without raising suspicion. At first glance, the document appeared to be an official form from the healthcare system. Its layout, language, and presentation all carried familiar characteristics of communications from a medical authority. There was no detail that immediately indicated it was a forged document. However, upon closer examination, investigators began to identify inconsistencies. They analyzed the origin of the document, including its format, data structure, and associated digital markers. The results showed that the document was not generated from an official system, but originated from a personal device. This indicated that the vaccine invitation was not part of a legitimate medical process, but a document deliberately created. After identifying the forged nature of the document, investigators began to expand their focus to factors related to the victim. They carried out a deeper examination of his personal life, relationships, and individuals directly connected to his living environment. During this process, a notable detail was discovered. The victim was living with a woman, and this woman had a son who was a doctor. At the initial stage, this was simply background information. However, when placed within the overall context of the case where someone had impersonated a medical worker to carry out a deliberate act, this detail immediately became significant. Investigators realized that to create such a convincing situation, the person responsible would not only need preparation in terms of appearance, but also a clear understanding of how the healthcare system operates, from designing documents, to the process of approaching patients, to performing actions in a way that would not raise suspicion. These are factors that someone with medical knowledge could fully possess. From that point, the investigative team's attention began to focus more on individuals who could meet these conditions. At the same time, investigators continued to examine the digital traces related to the vaccine invitation and other forged documents. They traced the origin of the data, analyzed the device used to create the materials, and identified the associated geographic location. The analysis showed that these documents were created from a personal device located within the local area, rather than from any official healthcare system. This further reinforced the hypothesis that the entire incident had been prepared in advance by a specific individual, rather than being an error within the system. At the same time, the police also reviewed the personal relationships surrounding the victim in order to determine who might have had a motive to approach him. They examined factors such as family relationships, personal interests, and any changes in living circumstances that could create potential conflict. When all of these elements were placed together, from forged documents and digital traces to personal connections, the investigation began to gradually narrow its focus, pointing toward individuals who not only had the capability to carry out the act, but also a reason to do so. During this process, they returned to a detail that had previously drawn the attention of the investigative team. The son of the woman living with the victim was a doctor. When examining this individual's recent activities more closely, investigators discovered several notable signs, including access to documents related to medical forms and steps of preparation that could be linked to a disguise plan. As the pieces gradually came together, from forged documents and digital traces to access to medical knowledge, the investigation began to focus on a single individual. That person was Thomas Kwan, the son of the woman living in the house. From someone who initially appeared only in the victim's family background, Thomas Kwan had now become the central suspect in the case. And as investigators continued to analyze the evidence, they began to realize that this incident may not have been a spontaneous act, but rather the result of a plan that had been prepared in advance. What, then, could have led a person with medical knowledge to plan such a crime? To understand why a doctor, a person trained to save lives, could plan such an act, investigators began to look back at the life and personal development of Thomas Kwan. Kwan graduated in medicine from Newcastle University, a solid academic foundation that led him into the medical field as a formally trained doctor. He then worked for many years as a general practitioner in Sunderland. In the eyes of colleagues and patients, Kwan was not an individual who stood out in a negative way. He was seen as an ordinary middle-aged doctor with a stable career and a life that showed no clear signs of irregularity. There was no criminal record, no public signs of extreme behavior. From the outside, Kwan's profile fit the image of someone living within the rules, with a stable profession and maintaining a relatively private life. However, as investigators looked deeper into his personal life, they began to realize that behind that apparent stability, there was another factor, a prolonged concern related to family assets. During the investigation, authorities began examining Kwan's family structure. His mother lived in Newcastle and owned a house along with a number of valuable assets. For many years, Kwan believed that these assets would eventually belong to him as part of his inheritance. This belief was not unusual at first. However, when the family situation changed, specifically when his mother began a relationship with Patrick O'Hara and the two started living together, Kwan's perception of the future of those assets began to shift. According to investigators, this moment marked a turning point in Kwan's thinking. From a personal expectation, he gradually developed a concern that his mother's assets might no longer certainly belong to him, but could instead be shared or left to someone else. The initial thoughts were gradually reinforced, repeated, and became more extreme over time. When left unchecked, they shifted from concern to a more oppositional way of thinking, where O'Hara was no longer simply his mother's partner, but instead became an obstacle to his personal interests. This shift in perception is considered a key factor. When an individual begins to see another person as an obstacle rather than an independent human being, moral boundaries can gradually begin to shift. According to investigators, this process of changing perception laid the foundation for what followed, from thoughts to intent, and ultimately to the formation of a deliberate plan. All of it stemmed from an obsession related to family assets. And within that plan, Patrick O'Hara was no longer viewed as a person in a normal relationship, but as a target to be removed. When Thomas Kwan was invited to speak with the police, he initially denied any involvement in the incident. However, investigators presented a sequence of evidence indicating that the plan had been prepared in advance. During the interrogation, investigators focused on the forged documents, the preparatory steps, and the disguised materials that had been discovered. The questioning revealed that this was not a spontaneous act, but a carefully calculated plan. Investigators also analyzed the financial motive and family relationships, suggesting that concerns over assets may have been the driving factor behind Kwan's actions. After the initial meeting with the police, the investigation quickly moved into a decisive stage. Investigators continued to cross-check the evidence that had been collected, including the forged medical documents used to create the vaccine appointment, the disguised materials, and traces indicating that the plan had been prepared in advance. When the entire chain of evidence was put together, the police concluded that they had sufficient grounds to proceed with an arrest. Thomas Kwan was subsequently arrested on charges related to attempted murder. From that point on, the case officially moved from the investigative phase to criminal prosecution. The case was later brought to trial at Newcastle Crown Court, marking the stage where everything collected during the investigation was systematically presented in court. In the courtroom, the prosecution began to lay out the entire sequence of events in a clear order, from the unusual signs at the hospital, the process of verifying the false identity, to tracing the digital evidence that led to the suspect. Each piece was placed back into its proper position, no longer fragmented as it had been in the early stages of the investigation. The focus of the prosecution's case lay in how Thomas Kwan constructed a false identity as a healthcare worker in order to approach the victim. The prosecutor described in detail how the defendant prepared documents, created a vaccine appointment that did not exist in the system, and used a disguise to create a situation that was sufficiently convincing. The objective of this plan was not only to gain access to the victim, but to do so in a context where the victim would fully trust him and raise no suspicion. In court, the evidence presented showed that this was not a spontaneous act. On the contrary, the entire process bore clear signs of prior preparation, from creating documents, selecting the timing, to carrying out the act in a way that aligned with standard medical procedures. The prosecutor emphasized that the defendant had used his own professional medical knowledge to construct a highly convincing scenario. A key point in the prosecution's argument was that, without a medical background, executing a plan with such a level of detail would have been difficult to carry out in the manner it occurred. This factor made the case not merely an act of assault, but one that was designed based on professional knowledge. In the early stage of the investigation, Thomas Kwan had denied any involvement in the case. However, when the full chain of evidence was presented in court, from forged documents and digital traces to elements directly linking him to the plan, his denial gradually became inconsistent with what had been proven. Faced with the weight of this evidence, Kwan ultimately changed his position. He admitted to the charge of attempted murder, ending the denial he had maintained in the initial stage. After reviewing the entire case file, including physical evidence, investigative analysis, and the defendant's confession, the judge concluded that Thomas Kwan's actions were not a momentary decision. This was a deliberate plan, prepared in advance with the intention of causing serious harm to the victim's life. The court determined that the severity of the act lay not only in its potential consequences, but also in the method of execution of a plan built on the victim's trust in the healthcare system. Based on these assessments, Thomas Kwan was sentenced to 31 years and 5 months in prison. In addition to the prison sentence, he was also stripped of his medical license and removed from the medical register, meaning he would no longer be able to return to work in the medical profession in the future. In the sentencing remarks, the judge emphasized that for a doctor, someone trained to protect and treat patients, to use that knowledge to cause harm was an especially serious factor. This was not only a violation of the law, but also a breach of the fundamental trust between patients and those working in the medical field. The story you have just followed is based on a real case that occurred in January 2024 in Newcastle, England. involving an attack against Patrick O'Hara. The content in this video has been edited from information gathered during the investigation and trial to help viewers better understand how a criminal case is uncovered from the initial clues to the moment the suspect is brought to justice. Fortunately, the victim survived the attack, but the case still leaves an important lesson to reflect on. When greed and obsession over property cross moral boundaries, wrong decisions can lead to serious consequences for many people. It is hoped that through this story, viewers not only gain a better understanding of how criminal investigations unfold, but also recognize the importance of transparency and responsibility within family relationships. If you are interested in real cases and analyses of criminal psychology like this, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming content.